A Cherokee boy stood in the crimson dust of a dying town, his small hand gripping a leather pouch that contained the fate of two broken souls. Behind him, flames licked at the trading post walls while gunshots echoed through the Colorado Canyon. And before him, a desperate rancher made a choice that would change 3 lives forever. They say the Colorado Territory breaks men like winter breaks tree branches. Jed Thornfield would later recall, but some breaks heal stronger than the original bone. The autumn of 1878 had been merciless to ranchers throughout the San Luis Valley, where the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains stretched long and cold across struggling homesteads. Cattle had died by the hundreds during an early blizzard in September, and now, with winter approaching again, desperation hung in the air like smoke from distant fires.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Jedediah Thornfield dismounted from his sorrel mare with movements that spoke of bone-deep weariness, his boots hitting the packed earth of Willow Creek's main street with hollow thuds. At 41, his body carried the accumulated pain of 2 decades working land that seemed determined to reject every seed, every fence post, every dream he had planted in its stubborn soil. His gray eyes, once bright with the optimism of a young homesteader, now held the flat resignation of a man who had buried too many hopes alongside too many loved ones. The town of Willow Creek sprawled before him like a collection of weathered bones scattered by some giant's careless hand. False-fronted buildings lined the dusty main street, their paint peeling and wood gray with age and neglect. The railroad had promised to come through here 5 years ago, bringing prosperity and growth, but the rails had curved north instead, leaving Willow Creek to slowly die of isolation and broken promises. Now only the most stubborn merchants remained, serving the scattered ranches and the occasional mining operation that still believed silver might be found in the played-out hills. Yet's coat, once a deep brown wool that Sarah had admired when she'd sewn the brass buttons on herself, now hung loose on his diminished frame. The sleeves showed patches where his wife's careful needlework had mended tears from barbed wire and thorny brush. Sarah, even 3 years after the fever took her, he could still hear her voice calling him in for supper, still smell her lavender soap lingering in their small ranch house. Their son Michael had been only 14 when the sickness came, old enough to understand death, but too young to accept it. The boy had lasted exactly 6 months after his mother's funeral before the silence and sorrow of the ranch drove him away. One morning Jed had awakened to find Michael's bed empty, a brief note on the kitchen table explaining that he was going to live with his uncle in Denver, that the ranch held too many ghosts for a boy trying to become a man. That had been 2.5 years ago. Yet's letters to Denver came back unopened, marked return to sender in his brother-in-law's rigid handwriting. Now Jed stood alone on Willow Creek's main street, his last $23 in his pocket and a Winchester rifle on his saddle that hadn't fired straight since a mountain lion attack 6 months earlier. The weapon's stock was cracked, its action loose from years of hard use, and yesterday it had misfired when a pack of wolves threatened his remaining cattle. He'd managed to drive them off with his revolver in sheer desperation, but the message was clear. Without a reliable rifle, he was defenseless against the predators that saw his struggling ranch as easy prey. The Colorado Territory in 1878 was no place for weakness. Rustlers moved through the valley like smoke, taking what they wanted from isolated homesteads. Wild animals grew bolder as winter approached, driven down from the mountains by hunger and cold. And lately there had been rumors of something worse. White men dressed as Indians, raiding small ranches and leaving behind evidence designed to inflame anti-native sentiment. Real Indians, the rumors claimed, were being blamed for attacks they hadn't committed, creating a powder keg of racial tension that threatened to explode into full-scale violence. Jed pushed these dark thoughts aside as he approached Morrison's. Trading Post, the largest building on Willow Creek's main street. The false front rose 2 stories, painted white, but now showing the gray wood beneath where wind and weather had stripped away the outer coating. A hand-painted sign advertised guns, ammunition, supplies, fair prices, though Jed wondered about the fairness of any prices in a town where merchants had no competition. The Trading Post's interior was a maze of shelves, barrels, and hanging goods that created narrow aisles between displays of everything a frontier family might need. Rifles lined one wall in wooden racks, their metal gleaming despite the dim light filtering through dusty windows. Barrels of flour, beans, and salt occupied the center of the store, while bolts of fabric, cooking implements, and mining tools filled every available space. The air was thick with the mingled scents of leather, tobacco, coffee, and the distinctive smell of black powder. Behind the counter stood Ezekiel Morrison, a man whose prosperity showed in his round belly and soft hands. Morrison had arrived in Willow Creek 5 years earlier with enough money to buy out the previous merchant and establish himself as the town's primary supplier. His prices were high, but his credit was generous to those who could prove their worth, and his store carried goods that couldn't be found anywhere else within 50 miles. He looked up as Jed entered, his pale blue eyes quickly assessing the rancher's worn clothes and desperate demeanor. "Thornfield," Morrison acknowledged with a nod that was neither friendly nor hostile. "Been expecting you. Heard you had trouble with wolves yesterday." News traveled fast in small communities, especially bad news. "Come looking for a new rifle, I guess." Jed nodded, removing his hat and running fingers through graying hair that needed cutting. "Winchester's done for. Stock's cracked, and the action's loose. Can't afford to miss when predators come calling." He approached the gun rack, his experienced eye examining the weapons on display. "What can you show me in my price range?" Morrison's smile was carefully neutral. "Depends on your range. Got a nice Henry repeater, .44 caliber, hardly used. Previous owner was a drummer who decided the traveling life wasn't for him." He lifted the rifle from its rack, the metal catching what light filtered through the store's windows. "Smooth action, accurate to 200 yards, holds 15 rounds, yours for $60. $60 might as well have been $600. Yet's entire remaining capital couldn't cover half that amount, and Morrison knew it. The merchant's offer was a polite way of establishing the conversation's parameters without causing unnecessary embarrassment. In frontier communities, a man's financial struggles were often public knowledge, but gentlemen maintained the fiction of privacy. "Anything more modest?" Jed asked, moving along the gun rack to examine less expensive options. A battered Spencer rifle caught his eye, its stock scarred, but its metal clean and well-maintained. "What about this one? Spencer's a good weapon," Morrison admitted, setting the Henry aside and lifting the Spencer for Yet's examination. Previous owner traded it for supplies last month. Single shot, but reliable. .58 caliber, so it hits hard. $28, and I'll throw in a box of cartridges. The price was fairer, but still beyond Yet's means, as Jed examined the Spencer, running his hands over its worn but functional components. A commotion outside caught both men's attention. Raised voices, the sound of horses' hooves, and something else, the high, frightened cry of a child in distress. Morrison frowned, moving toward the store's front window to investigate. Through the dusty glass, they could see 3 men on horseback surrounding something near the town's water trough. The riders were rough-looking types, unshaven, dressed in mismatched clothes that spoke of hard traveling and harder living. Their leader, a tall man with a scarred face and pale eyes, sat his horse with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted without consequence. His companions flanked him, hands resting casually on their gun butts. At the center of their attention was a boy, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, with the unmistakable features of Cherokee heritage. His black hair was long and unkempt, his clothes little more than rags held together by determination and hope.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Despite his obvious fear, he stood straight-backed in the dust, clutching something against his chest with both hands. His dark eyes darted between his tormentors, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "Well, well," the scarred leader was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the afternoon air. "What have we got here? Little Savage has got himself lost, boys. Long way from the reservation, ain't you, boy?" The man's tone was mockingly friendly, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey. One of his companions, a heavy-set man with graying hair, leaned forward in his saddle. "Probably stealing, boss. Indians are all thieves. Should search him. See what he's got hidden under them rags." His suggestion carried an undertone of violence that made the boy take an involuntary step backward. The third rider, younger than his companions, but with the same hard look in his eyes, laughed unpleasantly. "Could be carrying messages to other hostiles. Heard tell there's been Indian trouble south of here. Maybe this one's a scout." The accusation was ridiculous. The boy was clearly alone and frightened, but in the current atmosphere of racial tension, such claims could quickly turn deadly. Inside the trading post, Morrison's expression had darkened with concern and calculation. "That's trouble brewing," he muttered, more to himself than to Jed. "Those are Cassidy's boys. Drifters and troublemakers who've been hanging around town for the past week, drinking up their money and looking for ways to get more." Jed studied the scene through the window, his weathered hands tightening unconsciously into fists. The boy reminded him painfully of Michael at that age, small for his years, but trying desperately to project courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The protective instincts that had once made him a devoted father stirred to life after years of dormancy. Outside, the confrontation was escalating. The scarred leader had dismounted and was approaching the boy with deliberate slowness, clearly enjoying the terror he was causing. "Let's see what you got there, boy," he said, reaching for whatever the child was clutching. "Might be something worth having." The boy's response surprised everyone. Instead of cowering or running, he stepped forward and spoke in clear, unaccented English. "Please, sir, I'm not stealing. I'm looking for work. My name is Gray Wolf, and I can pay my way." His voice trembled slightly, but his words were steady and proud. This declaration seemed to amuse the three men enormously. The leader threw back his head and laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Pay your way? With what, boy?" "Wampum." "And beads?" His companions joined in the laughter, their horses stamping restlessly as they sensed their rider's aggressive mood. Gray Wolf's chin lifted defiantly. "I have money," he said, his small hands protective over whatever he was carrying. "Real money. And I can work harder than most men. I just need someone to give me a chance." The claim of having money only increased the men's interest, but not in any way that boded well for the boy. The leader's eyes narrowed with predatory focus. "Well, now that changes things. Indian boy with money is something worth investigating. Hand it over, and we'll see how much your life's worth." It was at this moment that Jed made a decision that would change everything. Without conscious thought, he set the Spencer rifle aside and walked toward the trading post's front door. Morrison called after him, warning him not to interfere, but Jed was already stepping into the afternoon sunlight, his hand resting casually on his revolver's grip. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Jed said conversationally, as if he were greeting friends at a church social. His voice carried the easy confidence of a man who had faced down charging bulls and mountain lions, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Beautiful day for a ride. Hope you're enjoying our little town." The three men turned toward him with varying degrees of surprise and annoyance. The leader, Cassidy, sized up this new threat with experienced eyes. He saw a lean, weathered rancher past his prime, Probably armed, but obviously outnumbered. Not particularly dangerous unless handled carelessly. This ain't your concern. Rancher, Cassidy said, his tone carrying a warning. We're just having a conversation with the boy here. Nothing that needs to concern honest folks. His emphasis on honest was clearly meant to question whether Grey Wolf belonged in that category. Jed nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this reasonable explanation. Conversation's a fine thing, he agreed. Though it works best when all parties are willing participants. His gray eyes met Grey Wolf's dark ones, and something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, and a promise of protection that transcended racial boundaries. The boys seemed to sense the shift in dynamics. His fear was still evident, but it was now mixed with hope. He took a half step toward Jed, still clutching his mysterious possession, but ready to accept whatever help might be offered. Cassidy's patience was wearing thin. Like I said, Rancher, this ain't your business. Boy's probably stolen whatever he's carrying. We're just making sure he returns it to its rightful owners. The lie was transparent, but in the absence of law enforcement, might often made right on the frontier. Funny thing about that, Jed replied, his voice still conversational but carrying a new edge. Boy doesn't look like a thief to me. Looks more like someone who's been traveling hard and could use a decent meal and a safe place to rest. He shifted slightly, a movement that brought his gun hand into clearer view. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 3 armed men against one, but the odds weren't as simple as they appeared. Jed had the advantage of position, with the trading post's wooden wall behind him providing cover. More importantly, he had the moral authority that came from protecting the innocent, and frontier communities had strong, if unwritten, codes about such matters. It was Grey Wolf who broke the tension in the most unexpected way possible. Looking directly at Jed with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young, he made an offer that would echo through both their lives. Sir, I know you don't know me, but I can see you're a good man. My family is gone, and I have nowhere to go. If you're looking for help on your ranch, I'll work harder than anyone you've ever hired. I'll ask for nothing but food and shelter, and maybe someone to teach me to read better. He paused, then added with desperate sincerity, Please, sir, take me with you. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, changing everything. And everyone who heard them. Cassidy and his men were caught off guard by this development, uncertain how to respond to what appeared to be a legitimate job negotiation. Morrison, watching from his store window, felt his merchant's instincts calculating the social and economic implications of what was unfolding, but it was Jed who felt the greatest impact. The boy's words struck him like a physical blow, awakening emotions he had buried along with his wife and given up for lost when his son left. Here was a child in desperate need, offering to work in exchange for the basic human necessities of food, shelter, and education. It was an arrangement that frontier families had made countless times, but something in Grey Wolf's manner suggested this was about more than mere economics. Looking into the boy's face, Jed saw something that reminded him powerfully of Michael. Not physical resemblance, but the same mixture of vulnerability and fierce independence that had characterized his son. Grey Wolf was asking not for charity, but for opportunity. Not for rescue, but for partnership. The distinction was crucial to a culture that valued self-reliance above almost everything else. Cassidy, sensing the moment slipping away from him, decided to force the issue. You're making a mistake, Rancher, he said, his hand moving more obviously toward his gun. Indian boys nothing but trouble. They're all thieves and liars, and this one's no different. Hand him over, and nobody needs to get hurt. Yet's response was calm but absolutely final. Boy asked me for work, and I'm inclined to give it to him. As for the rest of your opinions, you're entitled to them, but you're not entitled to force them on others. His stance shifted almost imperceptibly, a movement that spoke of long experience with dangerous situations. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. 3 men with guns against one. But the single man had something they lacked, the absolute moral certainty that came from protecting a child. In that instant, Grey Wolf made a choice that revealed both his courage and his desperation. Breaking from his position near the water trough, the boy ran to Yet's side, pressing himself against the rancher's leg like a son seeking his father's. Protection. The movement was so natural, so instinctively trusting, that it spoke volumes about the child's ability to read character, even in the most desperate circumstances. Cassidy's face twisted with frustrated anger. He had been denied his prey and made to look foolish in front of his men. In his world, such slights demanded violent response. His hand closed on his gun butt, and for a heartbeat, it seemed inevitable that the afternoon would end in bloodshed. But Morrison chose that moment to emerge from his trading post, cradling a shotgun in his arms with the casual familiarity of a man who knew how to use it. "Gentlemen," he called out pleasantly, "I hate to interrupt your conversation, but I've got customers waiting inside. Cassidy, you and your boys are welcome to conduct your business elsewhere." The merchant's intervention changed the mathematics of the confrontation. 3 against 2 was manageable, but a shotgun in experienced hands could end the fight before it began. Cassidy was many things, but he wasn't stupid enough to face those odds over one Cherokee boy. With visible reluctance, he released his grip on his weapon. "This ain't over," he said, directing the threat at both Jed and Grey Wolf. "Boy's trouble, mark my words. You'll regret taking him in." He remounted his horse with angry, jerky movements. His companions followed suit, though they kept their eyes on Jed and Morrison until they were well clear of shotgun range. As they rode away, Cassidy's voice carried back across the dusty street. "We'll be seeing you again, rancher. Count on it." The threat hung in the air like dust after their departure. Jed felt Grey Wolf press closer against his side, the boy's thin body trembling with delayed reaction to the danger they had just faced. Morrison lowered his shotgun but didn't set it. Aside, his experienced eyes tracking the 3 riders until they disappeared around the bend in the main street. "Well," Morrison said conversationally, "that was interesting. Hope you know what you're getting yourself into, Thornfield." Cassidy's not the type to forget a slight, and protecting that boy is going to be seen as a personal insult. His tone was neutral, but his meaning was clear. Jed had just made enemies of dangerous men. Jed looked down at Grey Wolf, who was still clutching his mysterious possession against his chest. The boy's dark eyes met his with an expression of gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. "What's your real story, son?" Jed asked gently. "Where did you come from, and what are you really carrying that's got you so scared?" Grey Wolf's response would change everything. Jed thought he knew about his own past, his son's disappearance, and the reasons why a Cherokee boy would risk everything to find him. But that revelation would wait until they were safely away from Willow Creek, and the watching eyes of those who might use such knowledge for their own dark purposes. For now, it was enough that 2 lost souls had found each other in the dust of a dying town, united by desperation, protected by courage, and bound by the kind of promise that could only be forged in the crucible of shared danger. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant toward evening, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, as Jed made the decision that would define the rest of both their lives. "Come on, son," he said quietly, his hand resting protectively on Grey Wolf's shoulder. "Let's go home." The ride back to Yet's ranch stretched across 15 miles of high desert punctuated by red rock formations and scattered stands of aspen trees already turning gold with autumn's touch. Grey Wolf rode behind Jed on the sorrel. Mare, his small hands gripping the rancher's belt, his mysterious leather pouch secured inside his ragged shirt. For the first hour, neither spoke, both lost in their own thoughts about what had transpired in Willow Creek and what lay ahead. Yet's ranch occupied a natural bowl in the foothills where Willow Creek itself wound through cottonwood groves, before disappearing into the sage-covered valley below. The house was modest but well built, squared logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew cleanly, and a covered porch that faced east to catch the morning sun. Nearby stood a small barn, corrals for horses and cattle, and the various outbuildings that accumulated around any working ranch over the years. As they crested the final ridge and the ranch came into view, Gray Wolf spoke for the first time since leaving town. "It looks like a good place," he said quietly. "Peaceful. Like somewhere a person could heal." His words carried a weight that suggested he spoke from experience with places that were neither good nor peaceful. Jed guided the mare down the familiar trail, noting details that had become invisible through years of routine. The way afternoon. Light played across the meadow where his cattle grazed, the sound of water moving over stones in the creek bed, the smell of wood smoke from neighbors' chimneys miles away. Seeing his home through Gray Wolf's eyes reminded him that what he had come to view as isolation and loneliness might appear quite different to someone who had known neither safety nor shelter. They dismounted near the barn, and Jed began the evening routine of unsaddling and caring for his horse. Gray Wolf watched attentively, clearly trying to learn the procedures that would be expected of him. When Jed handed him a curry comb and pointed toward the mare's dusty flanks, the boy set to work with an intensity that spoke of desperate eagerness to prove his worth. "Easy, son," Jed said gently, noting how the boy's thin arms trembled with effort. "She's not going anywhere, and neither are you. Take your time and do it right." It was the first direct reassurance he had offered about Gray Wolf's place on the ranch, and the boy's relieved smile was like sunrise after a long night. The house's interior reflected 3 years of bachelor living, functional but spare, clean but lacking the touches that made a house feel like home. Sarah's quilt still covered the furniture, and her books remained on their shelves, but the rooms felt hollow somehow, as if the laughter and conversation that had once filled them were just echoes waiting to fade completely. Gray Wolf stood in the main room, turning slowly to take in details that spoke of a family that had once been whole. "You can sleep in there," Jed said, indicating a small room off the main area. It had been Michael's room, though he didn't say so. The bed was narrow but comfortable, made up with blankets Sarah had woven on her loom. A small desk sat beneath the window, and shelves along one wall held books suitable for a young person's education. Gray Wolf approached the room cautiously, as if afraid that accepting its comfort might somehow make it disappear. He set his few possessions on the bed, the leather pouch he guarded so carefully, a small bundle containing what appeared to be extra clothing, and something wrapped in oiled cloth that might have been food saved against future hunger. "Thank you," he said simply, but his voice carried depths of gratitude that made Jed uncomfortable in the way that profound emotion often did among people unaccustomed to expressing it. "I know you don't know anything about me. Taking me in was a risk." Jed busied himself lighting the kerosene lamps as darkness gathered outside the windows. "We all take risks," he said pragmatically. "Question is whether they're worth taking. Time will tell whether this one was." He paused in his work, studying the boy's serious face. "But I'll say this. Anyone who can stand up to Cassidy and his bunch has more courage than most grown men I know." They prepared and shared a simple supper: beans and salt pork, cornbread, left over from the previous day, coffee that was stronger and blacker than Gray Wolf was accustomed to, but which he drank without complaint. As they ate, Jed found himself studying his unexpected guest, noting details that hadn't been apparent during the confrontation in town. Gray Wolf was younger than he had first appeared, probably closer to 10 than 12, but hardship had carved premature lines around his dark eyes and given his movements the careful precision of someone who had learned to make every action count. His clothes, though ragged, had been mended with care, suggesting either that he possessed sewing skills unusual for a boy his age, or that someone had cared for him until recently. "Where did you come from?" Jed asked as they finished eating. "Before Willow Creek, I mean. And don't tell me it's none of my business, because taking you into my home makes it my business. Grey Wolf set down his coffee cup and was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how much truth to share. When he spoke, his words were measured and careful. I've been traveling for 6 weeks, maybe 7. Coming from the east, following rumors and stories, trying to find someone. He met Yet's eyes directly. Trying to find you, actually. The statement hit Jed like a physical blow. Find me? Boy, I don't know you. Never seen you before today in my life. But even as he spoke, something nagged at the edge of his memory, a half-formed recognition that he couldn't quite bring into focus. You knew my sister, Grey Wolf said quietly. Her name was Running Deer, but the white people called her Mary. She worked for your family 3 years ago, before this sickness came. His voice grew smaller. She died trying to help your wife when the fever was bad. The words unlocked memories that Jed had buried along with his grief. Mary Crow Feather, a young Cherokee woman who had appeared at their door during Sarah's illness, claiming to know remedies that might help. She had stayed for 2 weeks, nursing Sarah with a combination of Cherokee plant medicine and frontier common sense, asking for nothing beyond food and a place to sleep. When Sarah died despite all their efforts, Mary had simply vanished one morning, leaving behind only a small bundle of herbs and a note saying she was sorry she couldn't do more. Mary was your sister, Jed said, the pieces falling into place. But her name was Crow Feather, not Wolf. Grey Wolf nodded solemnly. Cherokee names change as we grow and experience life. I was called Small Fox then, because I was quick and clever at hiding. But after Mary died and our grandmother passed, I had to become something stronger. Grey Wolf chose me during a vision quest. Jed absorbed this information, remembering Mary's gentle hands and soft voice as she tended Sarah in those final days. She had been perhaps 16 or 17, with the same dark eyes and serious demeanor that characterized her brother. What happened to her? He asked. Mary just disappeared after the funeral. I assumed she went back to her people. She came home to die, Grey Wolf said simply. The fever she caught from your wife spread through our camp. Mary was the first to go, then grandmother, then the others. By winter, there were only 5 of us left out of 37. His voice remained steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he reached for the leather pouch he had guarded so carefully. This belonged to her, he said, opening the pouch to reveal its contents. Inside was a small wooden cross, obviously hand-carved, alongside what appeared to be folded papers and a few other personal items. She wanted me to bring it back to you, along with something else. He unfolded one of the papers, revealing a letter written in the careful script of someone for whom English was a learned, rather than native language. Jed recognized Mary's handwriting from the note she had left, but this letter was much longer and more detailed. She wrote this while she was dying, Grey Wolf explained. About your family, about your son Michael, about things she learned while she was here that she thought you should know. He handed the letter to Jed with ceremonial gravity. She made me promise to find you and give you this, no matter how long it took. Yet's hands shook as he unfolded the letter completely. Mary's neat handwriting filled both sides of the paper, and the first lines made his heart race with a combination of hope and dread. Mr. Thornfield, it began, there are things about Michael's leaving that you need to know. Things I saw but didn't understand until it was too late to help. The letter went on to describe observations Mary had made during her time at the ranch, details about Michael's behavior and conversations that had seemed insignificant at the time, but which painted a disturbing picture when viewed together. According to Mary, Michael hadn't simply run away to Denver because he couldn't bear the memories of his mother's death. He had been driven away by threats and manipulation that Mary had witnessed but been too frightened to report. She writes here about men who came to the ranch while I was away, Jed said, his voice tight with growing anger. Men who talked to Michael, who told him things about his mother's death that weren't true. He looked up at Grey Wolf. "Did Mary tell you about this?" Grey Wolf nodded gravely. "She said there were bad men who wanted to hurt your family more than the sickness already had. Men who blamed Indians for bringing the fever, who wanted to use Michael's grief to cause trouble between white people and Cherokee." He paused, then added with the terrible wisdom of childhood trauma. "She said they succeeded." The implications hit Jed like a landslide. His son hadn't simply chosen to leave. He had been driven away by people who wanted to destroy what remained of Yet's family. The isolation and loneliness he had endured for the past 2.5 years weren't the natural result of grief and circumstance. They were the intended outcome of a deliberate campaign of cruelty. Who were these men? He demanded, his voice harsh with suppressed fury. Mary must have seen them, known something about them. "She did," Grey Wolf confirmed, pulling another paper from the pouch. This one was covered with sketches, faces drawn with surprising skill and detail, alongside notes describing the men's clothing, horses, and behavior. Mary was good at remembering faces and details. She drew these after each visit. Jed studied the sketches with growing recognition and rage. One face in particular stood out, a scarred man with pale eyes and an expression of casual cruelty. Below the drawing, Mary had written a name, Cassidy, the same man from town today. Grey Wolf confirmed, watching Yet's face carefully. Mary wrote that he was the leader, the one who did most of the talking to Michael. She said he told your son that Indians had poisoned his mother deliberately, that Mary herself had killed her with bad medicine. The room seemed to spin around Jed as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Cassidy hadn't simply been harassing a Cherokee boy in Willow Creek. He had been continuing a campaign of destruction that had begun with Sarah's death and Michael's departure. The confrontation earlier that day hadn't been a random encounter, it had been part of a pattern of cruelty stretching back years. "Why?" Jed asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Why would Cassidy want to destroy my family? What did we ever do to him?" Grey Wolf pulled out the final item from the pouch, a deed of some kind, yellowed with age and bearing official seals. "Mary found this in your son's room after he left," he said. "She thought it might be important, but she couldn't read all the words." Jed examined the document with growing amazement. It was a land patent issued by the territorial government, granting mineral rights to a section of land that included his ranch and several neighboring properties. The patent was dated 5 years earlier and bore the signature of a man named James Morrison, Ezekiel Morrison's brother. According to the family name listed, silver rights. Jed breathed, understanding flooding through him like ice water. There's supposed to be silver on this land, and someone's been trying to drive off the homesteader so they can claim it. He looked up at Grey Wolf. "That's why they killed Mary and her people with poisoned blankets. That's why they turned Michael against me. They want this land empty so they can mine it." The boy nodded solemnly. "Mary figured it out before she died. She said the fever wasn't natural, that it came from blankets given as gifts to our camp. Blankets that had been used by sick people first." His voice grew smaller. "She said the same men who were trying to take your land were trying to kill all the Cherokee in the valley so no one would be left to claim treaty rights." Jed felt a rage unlike anything he had experienced since the war building in his chest like steam in a boiler. His wife had died from a disease deliberately spread to eliminate witnesses. His son had been psychologically tortured into abandoning his home. An entire Cherokee band had been murdered for their land. And he had spent 3 years blaming himself and God for losses that were actually the result of human evil. "How long have you been carrying this knowledge?" he asked Grey Wolf. "How long have you been looking for me?" "Since Mary died," the boy replied. "She made me promise on her deathbed that I would find you and tell you the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. She said you deserved to know what really happened to your family." He met Yet's eyes with startling intensity. She also said you were the only white man she trusted to do something about it. The weight of that trust settled on Yet's shoulders. Like a mantle he wasn't sure he was worthy to wear. A dying young woman had entrusted her brother with a mission that had consumed months of dangerous travel and brought him face to face with the very men who had destroyed both their families. The courage required for such a journey was beyond anything Jed could have imagined. You could have been killed a dozen times over getting here, he said. Cassidy and his men would have shot you on sight if they'd known what you were carrying. Gray Wolf's smile was grim beyond his years. Cherokee children learn early that white men's justice doesn't extend to Indians. If we want justice, we have to create it ourselves. He gestured toward the papers spread across the table. Mary believed you were different. She thought you would care enough about the truth to risk fighting for it. As night deepened around the ranch house, Jed found himself looking at his life through completely different eyes. The isolation he had accepted as punishment for his failures was revealed as the intended result of a criminal conspiracy. The grief he had carried as proof of his inadequacy as a husband and father was shown to be the product of deliberate manipulation. Most importantly, the son he thought had rejected him had actually been driven away by lies designed to destroy their relationship. "There's more," Gray Wolf said quietly, pulling one final item from the pouch. It was a small photograph, creased and faded, showing Michael standing beside a young man Jed didn't recognize. On the back, someone had written an address in Denver, and the words, "If anything happens to me, tell Pat the truth. Mary found this hidden in Michael's mattress after he left," Gray Wolf explained. She thought it might mean he was planning to come back someday, when he was old enough to fight the men who had lied to him. Jed stared at the photograph of his son, noting how much Michael had grown even in the short time since leaving the ranch. The boy in the picture had his mother's eyes, but his father's determined jaw, and something in his expression suggested he had begun to question the stories that had driven him away from home. "He's alive," Jed whispered, the words carrying more hope than he had felt in years. "My son is alive, and he might be trying to find his way back to the truth." Mary believed he would, Gray Wolf confirmed. She said Michael was too smart to stay fooled forever, that eventually he would start asking questions that would lead him back home. He paused, then added with the directness of childhood, "She also said you would need help when that time came, because Cassidy wouldn't let your family reunite without a fight." As the implications of everything Gray Wolf had revealed settled into Yet's mind, he found himself faced with choices that would define not only his own future, but the fate of everyone touched by the conspiracy they had uncovered. The lonely rancher who had ridden into Willow Creek that morning no longer existed. In his place stood a man with purpose, allies, and enemies clearly defined. "Tomorrow we start planning," he said, his voice carrying a steel that had been absent for 3 years. "If Cassidy wants a fight over this land and these lives, then, by God, he's going to get one." He looked at Gray Wolf with new respect and understanding. "And I can't think of anyone I'd rather have watching my back than Mary Crowfeather's brother." Gray Wolf's smile was the first genuinely happy expression Jed had seen from him. "Mary would be proud," he said simply. "She always said that. Good people needed to stand together if they wanted to defeat the bad ones." Outside, coyotes called across the valley, their voices carrying news and warnings through the darkness. But inside the ranch house, 2 unlikely allies sat planning justice for crimes that had gone unpunished too long, united by grief that had been transformed into purpose and hope that had been forged in the crucible of shared truth. The Cherokee boy's journey was complete, his promise to his dying sister fulfilled. But the real adventure was just beginning, as they prepared to face an enemy who had already proven willing to kill to protect his secrets and claim his prizes. Dawn broke over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains with the kind of crystalline clarity that only came after a cold night in the high country. Jed woke to the sound of chopping wood, a rhythmic thunk-thunk-thunk that spoke of someone working with determined efficiency. Through his bedroom window, he could see Gray Wolf splitting kindling behind the house, his small frame wielding the axe with surprising skill and persistence. By the time Jed dressed and stepped outside, the boy had already accumulated a substantial pile of split wood and moved on to checking the fence line around the horse corral. His movements were purposeful and economical, suggesting someone accustomed to making himself useful without being asked or supervised. When he noticed Jed watching, he straightened and offered a tentative smile. "Good morning, sir," Gray Wolf said formally. "I hope the wood chopping didn't wake you. I wanted to start earning my keep right away." Despite his polite words, there was an underlying tension in his posture, as if he expected criticism or rejection, even for his helpful efforts. Jed poured himself coffee from the pot Gray Wolf had apparently prepared before beginning his outside chores. The brew was stronger than he usually made it, but perfectly palatable, suggesting the boy had been observing and learning even during their brief time together. "You don't have to call me sir," Jed said gently. "My name is Jed, and you're not a hired hand. You're family now." The word family seemed to hit Gray Wolf like a physical blow. His composed expression wavered for a moment, revealing the lonely child beneath the serious exterior. "Family," he repeated softly, as if testing how the concept felt in his mouth. "I haven't had family since Mary died." I'd forgotten what that word meant. Over breakfast, they began planning their approach to the conspiracy that had destroyed both their families. Jed spread Mary's sketches and documents across the kitchen table, studying them with the systematic attention of a man accustomed to solving complex problems. Gray Wolf watched intently, occasionally offering details that Mary had shared with him before her death. "The mineral rights patent is the key," Jed said, tapping the yellow document with one finger. "If we can prove that James Morrison obtained these rights fraudulently, then everything Cassidy and his gang have done becomes part of a larger criminal conspiracy." He looked up at Gray Wolf. "But proving fraud requires evidence that we don't have yet." Gray Wolf reached into his shirt and produced another folded paper that Jed hadn't seen the night before. "Mary found this too," he said, unfolding what appeared to be a letter written in a different hand. She couldn't read all of it, but she thought it was important. The letter was addressed to James Morrison and signed by someone named Colonel Harrison Webb. Its contents made Yet's blood run cold as he read descriptions of clearing operations designed to remove hostile Indians and recalcitrant settlers from designated mining territories. The language was bureaucratic and euphemistic, but its meaning was clear: systematic murder disguised as military necessity. "This Colonel Webb," Jed said grimly. "He's the one giving orders to Cassidy and the others. This isn't just random violence, it's an organized campaign backed by someone with official authority." He studied the letter's letterhead, noting military insignia and what appeared to be a Denver address. Gray Wolf nodded solemnly. "Mary said she heard Cassidy mention a colonel when he was talking to your son. She thought it might be someone important, someone who could make trouble disappear." His dark eyes met Yet's with startling intensity. Someone who could make people disappear too. The implications were staggering. They weren't just dealing with local criminals motivated by greed. They were confronting a conspiracy that reached into the territorial military command and possibly beyond. The scope of their enemies' resources and connections made their own position seem hopeless. "We need allies," Jed said finally. "People we can trust who have the authority to investigate these crimes and bring the perpetrators to justice." He paused, considering their options. "But finding such people won't be easy when we don't know how far the corruption extends." Gray Wolf was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the careful precision of someone offering valuable information. "There might be someone," he said slowly. "When Mary was dying, she told me about a Cherokee leader named Joseph Ridge who had been trying to document crimes against our people. She said he was working with some white officials who could be trusted. The name meant something to Jed, though he couldn't immediately place it. Then memory clicked into focus. Joseph Ridge was the son of Major Ridge, one of the Cherokee leaders who had been assassinated for signing the Treaty of New Echota decades earlier. The younger Ridge had spent years trying to bridge the gap between Cherokee and white communities while fighting for justice on behalf of his people. Ridge has influence in Denver, Jed said, his mind beginning to race with possibilities. If we could get word to him, if we could show him Mary's evidence and explain the connection to the mining conspiracy, he might be able to help us find honest officials to investigate. But first, they needed more evidence. The documents Mary had collected were compelling, but they represented only pieces of a larger puzzle. To build a case that could bring down the entire conspiracy, they would need to gather additional proof of the crimes that had been committed and the people responsible for ordering them. Over the following days, they developed a routine that combined the normal work of running a ranch with the more dangerous business of investigating their enemies. Gray Wolf proved to be an invaluable partner in both endeavors. His small size allowed him to move unseen through areas where Jed would have been conspicuous, while his Cherokee upbringing had taught him tracking and observation skills that complemented Yet's frontier experience. On the third morning after Gray Wolf's revelations, they rode together to the site where the Cherokee camp had been located before the poisoned blankets did their deadly work. The place was a natural meadow beside a stream, sheltered by cottonwood trees and easily defended against both weather and enemies. Now it was eerily silent, marked only by the blackened circles where fires had burned and the scattered remnants of what had once been homes. Gray Wolf moved through the abandoned camp with reverent solemnity, pointing out where different families had lived and explaining the relationships between the people who had died there. His voice remained steady as he described his grandmother's lodge, his sister's favorite place to gather medicinal plants, and the council fire where important decisions had been made. But Jed could see the pain in the boy's eyes as he confronted the physical reality of his losses. They were good people, Gray Wolf said quietly as they stood beside the stream where Mary had taught him to catch fish with his bare hands. They harmed no one, took nothing that wasn't freely given, tried to live in peace with all their neighbors. He knelt and placed his hand flat against the earth. They deserved better than to die from white man's diseases spread by white man's. As they searched the area for evidence that might have survived the months since the camp's abandonment, Jed found himself learning about Cherokee culture and values from Gray Wolf's matter-of-fact explanations. The boy spoke of the harmony that was supposed to exist between all living things, of the responsibility each person had to protect and care for the community, and of the belief that the earth itself was sacred and not to be damaged for temporary gain. Your sister understood something that most white people don't, Jed said as they examined the remains of what had been Mary's lodge. She saw past the differences in how we look and live to the things that make us the same underneath. He paused, then added with quiet conviction, "That's why she risked her life to help Sarah. And that's why she sent you to find me." Their investigation of the campsite yielded several important discoveries. Hidden beneath a pile of stones that appeared random, but which Gray Wolf recognized as a deliberate Cherokee marker, they found additional papers that Mary had concealed before the sickness overcame her. These included more sketches of Cassidy's associates, detailed notes about conversations she had overheard, and most importantly, a partial list of other locations where similar clearing operations had been carried out. She was documenting everything, Jed realized as he studied Mary's careful notes, building a case that could expose the entire conspiracy if it ever reached the right authorities. He looked up at Gray Wolf with new respect for the young woman's courage and foresight. "Your sister was a remarkable person." Gray Wolf's smile was sad but proud. "Mary always said that if you were going to fight evil, you had to be smarter than the people doing evil things. She spent months learning to read and write better so she could document crimes that others were trying to hide." He gestured toward the papers. She knew she might not live to see justice done, but she wanted to make sure the truth would survive even if she didn't. On their ride back to the ranch, they were intercepted by a neighbor, Tom Whitfield, whose small spread lay 5 miles to the north. Whitfield was a decent man in his 50s who had always maintained friendly relations with Jed, but his expression now was troubled and uncertain. "Jed," Whitfield said without preamble, "I need to warn you about something. Had visitors yesterday, asking questions about you and that Indian boy you took in." He glanced nervously at Gray Wolf, clearly uncomfortable discussing the subject in front of its object. They weren't friendly types, if you know what I mean. Yet's hand moved instinctively toward his gun belt. "What kind of questions, Tom? And who was asking them?" 3 men, rough-looking, led by a fellow with a scarred face. They wanted to know if the boy had been seen in the area, if you'd taken him in, what you might know about his background. Whitfield's weathered face was creased with worry. "I told them I minded my own business and suggested they do the same, but they didn't seem inclined to take the hint." The description matched Cassidy and his associates perfectly. Their enemies had wasted no time in trying to track down Gray Wolf after the confrontation in Willow Creek. The net was closing around them faster than Jed had anticipated. "Did they say what they wanted with the boy?" Jed asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Whitfield shook his head. "Just that he was wanted for questioning about some trouble down south." "But Jed, these weren't lawmen or soldiers. These were the kind of men who ask questions with their fists and don't much care about the answers." He looked directly at Gray Wolf, his expression softening slightly. "Boy, I don't know what you've done or what you know, but you've picked dangerous people to cross." "He hasn't done anything wrong," Jed said firmly. "And neither have I. If Cassidy and his friends want to cause trouble, they can bring it on. But they won't find us as easy to intimidate as they might expect." After Whitfield continued on his way, Jed and Gray Wolf rode home in thoughtful silence. The encounter had made it clear that their window of safety was rapidly closing. Soon they would have to choose between running and fighting, between abandoning their quest for justice and risking everything to see it through. That evening, as they sat planning their next moves by lamplight, Gray Wolf asked a question that had been weighing on his mind. "Jed, what if we can't prove everything Mary documented? What if the people behind this conspiracy are too powerful to be brought down by evidence and testimony?" Jed was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames dancing in the fireplace. When he answered, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Then we'll have to settle for making sure they can't hurt anyone else the way they hurt our families. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's just about stopping the harm, even if it means we might not survive to see the results." Gray Wolf asked with the directness of someone who had already faced death multiple times. "Especially then," Jed replied. "Your sister understood that. She could have stayed silent, stayed safe, and let the killers get away with their crimes. Instead, she chose to document the truth and send you to find me, knowing it might cost her life." He met Gray Wolf's eyes across the table. "Some things are worth dying for. Making sure these killers can't destroy any more families is one of them." Gray Wolf nodded slowly, understanding passing between them that transcended the differences in their ages and backgrounds. They were no longer just a lonely rancher and an orphaned Cherokee boy. They had become partners in a mission that was larger than either of their individual survival. "Tomorrow we start making contact with people who might be able to help." U.S., Jed decisively. "We'll send word to Joseph Ridge in Denver, and we'll start gathering more evidence against Cassidy and his associates." He paused, then added with grim determination, "And we'll start preparing for the fight that's coming, because these people have already proven they'll kill to protect their secrets." As they prepared for bed, Gray Wolf stopped at the door to his room and looked back at Jed with an expression of gratitude mixed with resolve. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not just for taking me in, but for believing in Mary's mission. For making me feel like I belong somewhere again." Jed felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you for trusting me with the truth," he replied. "And for giving me a reason to fight for something besides just survival." He paused, then added with quiet conviction, "Your sister chose well when she sent you to find me. We're going to make sure her sacrifice means something." That night, both of them slept better than either had in months, despite the dangers they knew were approaching. They had found in each other not just allies, but family, the kind of bond forged in shared purpose and mutual respect that was stronger than blood relations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and greater risks, but they would face them together, outside. The wind carried the sense of autumn through the valley. Dying leaves, wood smoke, and the clean smell of early snow in the high mountains. Change was coming to the Sandleys Valley, and two unlikely partners were preparing to meet it with courage, borrowed from a Cherokee woman's dying wish and hope, sustained by the belief that truth and justice could still triumph over greed and violence. The Cherokee boys' journey to find Jed Thornfield was complete, but their shared journey toward justice was just beginning. And somewhere in Denver, a young man named Michael Thornfield was asking questions that would soon bring him face to face with the truth about his family's destruction and his own manipulation by forces he was only beginning to understand. The message arrived on a gray October morning, delivered by a circuit rider named Father Miguel Santos, who served the scattered Catholic communities throughout the San Luis Valley. The elderly priest rode up to Yet's ranch house on a tired mule, his weathered face grave with the weight of dangerous news. Gray Wolf watched from the corral where he was training a young colt, his instincts immediately alert to the tension in the priest's posture. "Senator Thornfield," Father Santos said without dismounting, "I bring word from Denver that you need to hear immediately." He glanced nervously toward the mountains, as if expecting to see riders approaching. "And I'm afraid I cannot stay long to discuss it safely." Jed emerged from the barn where he had been repairing harness leather, his hands still holding the tools of his work. Something in the priest's manner made his stomach clench with foreboding. "What kind of news, Father?" "From whom in Denver?" The priest reached inside his robes and withdrew a sealed envelope, its paper quality suggesting official correspondence. "From Joseph Ridge, though he could not sign it openly. The message was passed through several hands before reaching me, and each person took great risks in carrying it." Father Santos's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Senator Ridge says to tell you that your son Michael is alive, but he is in great danger." Gray Wolf abandoned his work with the colt and moved closer, his dark eyes fixed on the envelope with laser intensity. Yet's hand shook as he broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter within. The handwriting was unfamiliar, obviously disguised, but the content made his heart race with a mixture of hope and terror. "Michael has begun asking questions about his mother's death and the circumstances of his departure from home," the letter began. "His inquiries have attracted the attention of Colonel Webb's associates in Denver, who are now watching him closely. 3 nights ago, someone attempted to break into his boarding house room. Yesterday, his employer received a visit from federal marshals, claiming Michael is wanted for questioning in connection with Indian uprisings in the South." Yet's face went white as he read further. According to Joseph Ridge's sources, Michael had somehow obtained information that led him to question the stories he had been told about Cherokee involvement in his mother's death. His investigations had brought him dangerously close to uncovering the truth about the conspiracy, making him a target for elimination rather than simply continued manipulation. "There is more, Senator," Father Santos said quietly. "Young Ridge includes a warning that Colonel Webb has dispatched a special unit to Colorado Territory with orders to eliminate all witnesses to the mining operation. This includes you, the Cherokee boy, and anyone else who might possess evidence of their crimes." Gray Wolf stepped forward, his young face set with determination. "How many men in this special unit, Father? And how much time do we have before they arrive?" The priest consulted a second piece of paper hidden within his robes. According to the information Joseph Ridge received, 12 men left Denver 4 days ago. They are traveling by railroad to Alamosa, then by horseback into the valley. He looked directly at Jed. "If they maintain their current pace, they will arrive here within 2 days." The mathematics were stark and unforgiving. 12 professional killers against one rancher and a Cherokee boy, with nowhere to run and no law enforcement they could trust. The conspiracy had finally decided that subtlety and manipulation were taking too long. They were moving to a final solution that would eliminate all threats permanently. But Joseph Ridge's message contained more than just warnings. Hidden within the seemingly routine text were coded references that only someone familiar with Cherokee culture would understand. Gray Wolf studied the letter intently, his lips moving silently as he decoded symbols and phrases that had been embedded in the English text. "There's a message here for me specifically," Gray Wolf said, his voice tight with excitement. "Ridge is telling us that help is coming, but we have to get to a specific location to meet it." He pointed to a seemingly innocent reference to the place where eagles nest above the sacred spring. "That's Crying Eagle Mesa, about 10 miles north of here." Jed knew the location, a virtually inaccessible plateau that could only be reached by a narrow trail known mainly to hunters and trappers. If Joseph Ridge was planning some kind of rescue or reinforcement, the mesa would be an ideal meeting place, defensible, hidden, and offering multiple escape routes for anyone familiar with the terrain. "But how do we know this isn't a trap?" Jed asked, his frontier caution warring with his desperate hope. "How do we know that Colonel Webb hasn't intercepted Ridge's communications and turned them to his own advantage?" Father Santos reached into his robes one final time and produced a small object wrapped in soft leather. "Center Ridge, Segu would ask that question," he said with a slight smile. "He sent this as proof that his message is genuine." Gray Wolf unwrapped the leather to reveal a small silver medallion bearing Cherokee symbols that Jed didn't recognize, but which clearly meant something significant to the boy. His eyes widened with amazement and relief. "This belonged to my grandmother," he breathed. "Mary had it when she died, but I thought it was lost when our camp was destroyed. Ridge's people recovered it from the burial site," Father Santos explained. "They have been investigating the massacre of your band for months, gathering evidence and documenting the crimes committed there." His expression grew grave. "What happened to your people was not an isolated incident, boy. Similar attacks have occurred throughout the territory, all following the same pattern." As the priest prepared to depart, he delivered one final piece of information that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. "There is something else you must know," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. "Joseph Ridge's investigation has revealed that the man you know as Cassidy is not just a hired killer. His real name is Captain Thomas Cassidy, and he is Colonel Webb's younger brother." The revelation hit like a physical blow. The random violence and cruelty they had attributed to Cassidy's criminal nature was actually part of a systematic family enterprise spanning civilian and military authority. The scope of the conspiracy was even larger than they had imagined, reaching into the highest levels of territorial government and military command. "That explains how he operates with such impunity," Jed said grimly. "And why local law enforcement looks the other way when he commits his crimes. He's protected by his brother's official position." After Father Santos departed, Jed and Gray Wolf spent the rest of the morning preparing for what might be their final stand. They gathered their most essential possessions, loaded weapons and ammunition, and made plans for reaching Crying Eagle Mesa before Colonel Webb's special unit could locate and corner them at the ranch. As they worked, Gray Wolf shared more details about the coded message from Joseph Ridge. According to the Cherokee leader's plan, all eyes were already moving into position throughout the valley, including several former Union Army officers who had become suspicious of Colonel Webb's activities and a group of Cherokee warriors who had been tracking the military unit since it left Denver. "Your sister's sacrifice is finally bearing fruit," Jed told Gray Wolf as they secured important papers in waterproof containers. The evidence she gathered is being used to build a case that could bring down the entire conspiracy, but only if we survive to testify about what we know. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor who nearly derailed all their carefully laid plans. A lone rider appeared on the southern trail, approaching the ranch house under a flag of truce improvised from a white shirt tied to a rifle barrel. As the figure drew closer, Yet's heart nearly stopped. It was Michael, older and leaner than when he had left 3 years earlier, but unmistakably Yet's son. The boy had become a young man during his time in Denver, his shoulders broader and his face bearing the lines that came from hard experience and difficult knowledge. But his eyes were still the same blue-gray that Jed remembered, now filled with a mixture of determination, fear, and desperate hope. "Hello, Pa," Michael said as he dismounted 20 yards from the house, his hands carefully visible and away from his weapons. "I know you probably don't want to see me after the way I left, but I need to talk to you about Ma's death and what really happened here." Gray Wolf emerged from the barn where he had been hiding, his rifle trained on Michael until Jed signaled that the young man posed no immediate threat. The Cherokee boy's eyes narrowed as he studied the newcomer, noting details of clothing, equipment, and bearing that might indicate whether this reunion was genuine or part of another trap. "You're Michael Thornfield," Gray Wolf said, his voice carefully neutral. "Your sister Mary spoke of you often before she died. She said you had been tricked into leaving your father by lies about Cherokee people." Michael's face showed genuine confusion at the mention of Mary, followed by dawning recognition and horror as he began to understand the connections between his own story and the Cherokee woman who had tried to save his mother. "Mary is dead? The woman who nursed Ma during the fever? But how do you know about her, and who are you?" As the three of them gathered in the ranch house kitchen, the full scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed both their families began to emerge through their shared testimonies. Michael had spent months in Denver investigating discrepancies in the official story of his mother's death, eventually uncovering evidence that the fever epidemic had been deliberately caused by contaminated blankets distributed to Cherokee camps. "I found records of the blanket distribution," Michael said, producing documents from his saddlebags that complemented the evidence Mary had gathered. "And I found correspondence between Colonel Webb and territorial officials, discussing the need to clear problem populations from designated mining areas." But Michael's investigation had also revealed something that neither Jed nor Gray Wolf had known. The conspiracy extended beyond simple land grabbing into a systematic campaign designed to provoke a war between white settlers and Native Americans. The ultimate goal was to justify military occupation of the entire territory, giving Colonel Webb and his associates complete control over mineral extraction and territorial development. They wanted to create enough racial hatred and violence to convince Washington that only military rule could maintain peace, Michael explained. Every Cherokee death, every settler family destroyed, every act of violence they committed was designed to make the situation worse until federal intervention became inevitable. Gray Wolf absorbed this information with the grim satisfaction of someone whose darkest suspicions had been confirmed. "Mary suspected something like this," he said quietly. "She said the attacks on our people were too organized, too systematic to be random violence. She thought someone was trying to start a war." As evening approached, the three of them made final preparations for the journey to Crying Eagle Mesa. Michael's arrival had complicated their plans, but also strengthened their position. His knowledge of the conspiracies, Denver connections complemented their evidence of local crimes, creating a more complete picture of the criminal enterprise they were fighting. "There's something else you need to know," Michael said as they prepared to depart. "I wasn't the only one investigating this conspiracy in Denver. There's a federal marshal named Hayes who has been building his own case against Colonel Webb, and he's supposed to arrive in the territory tomorrow with arrest warrants." The news offered hope that their enemies might finally face justice, but it also meant that the next 24 hours would be crucial. If they could survive until Marshal Hayes arrived with his warrants, the evidence they had gathered might be enough to bring down the entire conspiracy. If they failed, the truth would die with them as they mounted their horses and prepared to leave the ranch that had been home to 3 generations of Thornfields. Jed felt a profound sense of completion. His son had returned. The truth about his wife's death was finally known, and the Cherokee boy who had brought him back to life was about to help him fight for justice. "Whatever happens at the mesa," he said to both young men, "I want you to know that having you both here, fighting beside me, is worth whatever comes next." Gray Wolf and Michael exchanged glances, understanding passing between them despite their different backgrounds and experiences. They were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance. They had become brothers united in a common cause, ready to risk everything to ensure that the truth would survive even if they did not. The trail to Crying Eagle Mesa wound through terrain that seemed designed by nature to test the resolve of anyone foolish enough to attempt its passage. Jed led the way on his sorrel mare, followed by Michael on a sturdy bay gelding he had acquired in Denver, with Gray Wolf bringing up the rear on the nimble paint pony that had become his preferred mount during their weeks together. Behind them, the lights of scattered ranches twinkled in the valley like fallen stars, while ahead loomed the dark bulk of the mesa that would either shelter them or become their tomb. They rode in tense silence, each man alert for signs of pursuit or ambush. The October night was cold enough that their breath formed visible clouds in the moonlight, and frost was already beginning to form on the exposed rocks along the trail. Winter was coming early to the high country, and the weather would soon make travel through the mountains virtually impossible for anyone not intimately familiar with the terrain. Michael broke the silence as they paused to rest their horses beside a small spring that marked the halfway point of their journey. "Pa, I need to tell you something about the years I spent in Denver," he said, his voice carrying the weight of confession. "About why I really stayed away so long, and why I believed the lies they told me about Ma's death." Jed studied his son's face in the moonlight, noting the lines of guilt and shame that had carved themselves around his eyes. "You don't know any explanation, son. What matters is that you're here now, and you know the truth." But Michael shook his head, determination overriding his father's attempt at absolution. "I need to say this while I still can, before whatever's waiting for us up on that mesa," he insisted. "When Cassidy came to the ranch after Mag died, he didn't just tell me lies about Cherokee medicine causing her death. He showed me things." Gray Wolf's attention sharpened at this revelation. Throughout their planning and preparation, no one had mentioned physical evidence being used to manipulate Michael's grief. "What kind of things?" the Cherokee boy asked quietly. "Photographs," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Pictures of other white women who had died after receiving Cherokee medical treatment. Documents that seemed to prove that Indians were deliberately killing settlers by giving them poisoned remedies instead of helpful ones." He looked directly at Gray Wolf. It wasn't just emotional manipulation. They had created what looked like a pattern of Cherokee murders disguised as failed medical care. The sophistication of the deception was staggering. The conspiracy had gone far beyond simple lies and intimidation to create fabricated evidence that would convince even a grieving son that his mother's Cherokee nurse had been her killer rather than her would-be savior. The resources and planning required for such an operation spoke to the vast scope of Colonel Webb's criminal enterprise. "That's why I stayed in Denver so long," Michael continued. "I was trying to prove that the photographs and documents were genuine, that I was right to blame Cherokee people for Ma's death." His voice cracked with emotion. "It took me 2 years to discover that the photographs had been staged using bodies from a cholera epidemic, and the documents were forgeries created by military clerks working for Colonel Webb." Jed felt a surge of protective anger toward his son, understanding now the depth of psychological torture Michael had endured. The boy hadn't simply been deceived by grief. He had been systematically manipulated by people skilled in the art of turning victims into weapons against their own interests. "When did you finally realize the truth?" Grey Wolf asked, his tone carrying no judgment despite the pain Michael's beliefs had caused Cherokee communities throughout the territory. 3 months ago, Michael replied. "I found the original photographs in a Denver morgue, along with records showing that the same bodies had been used in multiple stage scenes. That's when I knew I had been used as part of something much larger and more evil than I had imagined." He looked up at the mesa towering above them. "And that's when I started the investigation that led me back here." They resumed their climb as the moon reached its zenith, casting stark shadows across the rocky trail. The path became increasingly treacherous as they ascended, forcing them to dismount and lead their horses through sections where a single misstep would send both horse and rider tumbling into the darkness below. Grey Wolf's mountain experience proved invaluable as he guided them around obstacles and identified safer routes through the most dangerous passages. As they neared the mesa's summit, the sound of their horses' hooves on stone was suddenly echoed by similar sounds from above. Someone was moving on the plateau, and whoever it was made no attempt at concealment. Jed signaled for silence as they took cover behind a jumble of boulders, weapons drawn and ready for whatever was about to emerge from the darkness ahead. A voice called down to them from the mesa top, speaking in Cherokee, but loud enough for them to understand its peaceful intent. Grey Wolf responded in the same language, engaging in what sounded like a recognition ritual designed to identify friends from enemies. After several exchanges, he turned to Jed and Michael with obvious relief. "It's Joseph Ridge himself," Grey Wolf announced. "He's here with the allies he promised, and they've been waiting for us since sunset." The boy's voice carried a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. "But he says we need to move quickly because Colonel Webb's men are already climbing the other side of the mesa." The final ascent to the plateau required them to abandon their horses and continue on foot up a narrow chimney in the rock face that could accommodate only one person at a time. Grey Wolf went first, his Cherokee training allowing him to find handholds and footholds that were invisible to less experienced climbers. Michael followed, his Denver street wisdom adapting quickly to the demands of vertical terrain, while Jed brought up the rear, his rancher's strength compensating for his lack of mountaineering experience. The mesa top revealed itself as a natural fortress roughly 2 acres in size, surrounded on all sides by sheer cliffs that made it virtually impregnable to direct assault. Ancient Cherokee fire circles and sacred markers indicated that this place had been used as a refuge and ceremonial site for generations, its spiritual significance adding weight to the alliance that had brought them together. Joseph Ridge stepped forward to greet them as they reached the plateau, and Jed found himself facing a man whose presence commanded immediate respect. Ridge was perhaps 50 years old, with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to leadership under the most difficult circumstances. His face bore the weathered lines of countless battles fought with words rather than weapons. But his eyes held the steel of someone prepared to use violence when diplomatic solutions failed. "Mr. Thornfield," Ridge said, extending his hand in the white man's gesture of greeting while maintaining the formal dignity that characterized Cherokee diplomacy. "Your son speaks highly of your courage and your commitment to justice. I am honored to meet the man who gave Mary Crowfeather's brother a home when he needed one most." Behind Ridge stood a group of 6 men who represented an alliance that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. 3 were Cherokee warriors, their faces painted for battle and their weapons ranging from traditional bows to modern rifles. 2 were former Union Army officers whose disgust with Colonel Webb's corruption had led them to risk court-martial by opposing his operations. The 6th was a man Jed didn't recognize, but whose badge identified him as the federal marshal they had been hoping would arrive in time. "Marshal Hayes," the lawman introduced himself, stepping forward to shake hands with each of the new arrivals. "I've been tracking Colonel Webb's activities for 6 months. And the evidence you've gathered has given me everything I need to bring federal charges against his entire organization." He gestured toward the papers protruding from Michael's saddlebags. "But first we need to survive long enough to testify." As if summoned by the marshal's words, the sound of men climbing the eastern face of the mesa drifted up from the darkness below. Colonel Webb's special unit had indeed tracked them to this final refuge, and the confrontation that had been building for months was finally at hand. Ridge's allies immediately began positioning themselves around the mesa's perimeter, using the natural rock formations as cover while maintaining clear fields of fire toward the climbing routes. "How many are coming up?" Jed asked, checking his rifle and counting the ammunition he carried. One of the Cherokee warriors, a man Ridge, introduced as Standing Bear, had been monitoring the enemy's approach since before sunset. 12 men as the message warned," he reported in accented but clear English. "But they are not all soldiers. Some are hired killers, some are territorial militia, and at least 2 are federal marshals who believe they are pursuing legitimate criminals." This information complicated their tactical situation significantly. They couldn't simply shoot everyone who appeared on the mesa without risking the lives of lawmen who were acting in good faith based on false information provided by the conspiracy. They would need to identify their true enemies while avoiding a massacre that could turn public opinion against their cause. "We need to get them talking before the shooting starts," Marshal Hayes said, understanding the same dilemma. "If I can identify the legitimate federal officers among them, I might be able to prevent unnecessary bloodshed by explaining the real situation." But even as they made these plans, the sound of climbing men grew closer, and voices began to echo up from the cliff face. Among them, Jed recognized the harsh tones of Captain Thomas Cassidy, no longer attempting to disguise his military bearing or official authority. The man who had destroyed both Cherokee and white families was finally revealing his true nature. "Thornfield." Cassidy's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "We know you're up there with the Indian boy and whoever else you've convinced to join your cause. This is Captain Thomas Cassidy of the United States Army, and I'm ordering you to surrender." Immediately, Marshal Hayes cupped his hands around his mouth and called back, "This is Federal Marshal Hayes, and I have warrants for your arrest, Captain. You are ordered to cease your assault and prepare to answer charges of murder, conspiracy, and treason against the United States." The response was immediate and violent. Gunfire erupted from the climbing routes as Cassidy's men abandoned any pretense of legal authority and committed themselves to eliminating the witnesses who could destroy their criminal enterprise. Bullets sparked off the stone formations where Ridge's defenders had taken cover, while muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireflies. The battle for Crying Eagle Mesa had begun, and its outcome would determine not just the fate of the men trapped on its summit, but the future of justice in the Colorado Territory. Standing Bear and his Cherokee warriors moved with silent efficiency around the plateau's edge, using boughs to pick off climbers who exposed themselves while advancing. The former Union officers provided covering fire with their rifles, their military training evident in their disciplined volleys and strategic positioning. Michael proved his worth as a fighter by locating a position that commanded one of the main climbing routes and systematically denying it to the attackers with carefully aimed shots. His Denver Street experience had taught him patience and precision that served him well in this deadlier game. Gray Wolf, meanwhile, seemed to vanish into the rocks like a ghost, appearing wherever the defense was weakest and using his small size and Cherokee stealth training to move unseen between positions. But it was Jed who found himself facing the most crucial test of the battle. As the fighting raged around the mesa's perimeter, a rope appeared over the plateau's southern edge, followed immediately by Captain Thomas Cassidy himself, the man who had orchestrated the murder of Sarah Thornfield and the destruction of Gray Wolf's people. Had finally come to finish his work personally. "Just you and me now, rancher," Cassidy snarled as he pulled himself onto the plateau, his scarred face twisted with years of accumulated hatred. No Cherokee medicine woman to hide behind, no federal marshals to protect you. Just a broken-down settler who doesn't know when he's beat. Jed stepped out from behind the rock formation where he had been taking cover, his rifle held ready, but not yet aimed. Around them, the battle continued, but this confrontation had become personal in a way that transcended the larger conflict. "I know exactly what I am," Jed replied quietly. "I'm a man whose wife was murdered by your poisoned blankets, whose son was driven away by your lies, whose life was destroyed by your greed." Cassidy's response was to raise his own rifle, but before he could fire, Gray Wolf appeared beside him, as if materializing from the stone itself. The Cherokee boy's knife gleamed in the moonlight as it pressed against Cassidy's throat, his young voice carrying the authority of someone who had already faced death and found it less frightening than injustice. "This man killed my sister, and my grandmother and 35 other Cherokee people," Gray Wolf said, his words directed at Jed but his eyes never leaving Cassidy's face. "According to Cherokee law, his life belongs to me now." For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in a tableau that represented all the grief, hatred, and hope that had brought them to this place. Cassidy's eyes darted between Yet's rifle and Gray Wolf's knife, calculating his chances of survival and finding them poor. Around the mesa, the sounds of battle were beginning to fade as Ridge's defenders gained the upper hand over the remaining attackers. "Wait," Jed said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "If we kill him now, he becomes a martyr. His brother can claim we murdered a federal officer in the performance of his duty." He looked directly into Gray Wolf's dark eyes. "Your sister wanted justice, not just revenge. Let's give her what she really wanted." It was Marshal Hayes who provided the solution, approaching with his handcuffs ready and his badge clearly visible. "Captain Thomas Cassidy," he announced formally, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason against the United States of America. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the marshal secured his prisoner, the remaining members of Colonel Webb's special unit began surrendering or fleeing back down the mountain. The federal officers among them, upon learning the truth about their mission, immediately switched sides and began helping to document the evidence that would be needed for prosecution. Dawn was breaking over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains as the survivors gathered on Crying Eagle Mesa to assess their victory and count their costs. 3 of Ridge's defenders had been wounded, but none killed. Among the attackers, 5 were dead and 7 captured, including Captain Thomas Cassidy himself. Most importantly, the evidence needed to prosecute the entire conspiracy had been preserved and was now in federal custody. But for Jed Thornfield, Gray Wolf, and Michael, the real victory was simpler and more profound. They had survived as a family, united by shared struggle and mutual respect that transcended the racial barriers their enemies had tried to use against them. The lonely rancher, the orphaned Cherokee boy, and the manipulated son had forged bonds that would last for the rest of their lives as they prepared to descend from the mesa and begin the journey toward a new future. Joseph Ridge approached them with the formal dignity that marked all his important communications. "The Cherokee people will remember what has happened here," he said solemnly. "And we will remember the courage of the white men who stood with us when justice demanded it." Gray Wolf looked out over the valley where his sister had died trying to save Sarah Thornfield, where their people had been murdered for the crime of occupying valuable land, and where 3 broken families had finally found healing in their shared commitment to truth. "Mary would be proud," he said simply, speaking to both his living family and his dead sister. The promise has been kept. 6 months later, spring had transformed the San Luis Valley into a tapestry of wildflowers and new grass that stretched from the foothills to the distant peaks. The Thornfield Ranch bustled with activity that would have been unimaginable during the lonely years following Sarah's death. Gray Wolf worked alongside Michael in the expanded horse corral, breaking and training a string of Mustangs they had captured in the high country, while Jed supervised the construction of additional buildings that would accommodate their growing operation. The trials in Denver had concluded just as the snows began to melt, with Colonel Harrison Webb receiving a life sentence for treason, murder, and conspiracy. Captain Thomas Cassidy had been hanged for his crimes, but not before his testimony revealed the full scope of the mining conspiracy that had claimed so many innocent lives throughout the territory. The mineral rights patents that had motivated so much death and destruction were declared fraudulent, and the lands were returned to their rightful owners. But the most satisfying outcome of the legal proceedings had been the vindication of Mary Crow Feather's memory and the official recognition of her heroism in documenting the crimes against her people. A monument had been erected at the site of the Cherokee camp, bearing her name and the names of all 37 tribal members who had died from the poisoned blankets. Joseph Ridge had presided over the dedication ceremony, speaking words that honored both the Cherokee dead and the white allies who had fought for justice. "The mail's here," Michael called from the front porch, where he had been watching for the weekly delivery from Willow Creek. The routine had become a source of anticipation for all three men, as correspondence now brought news of friends and allies rather than threats and demands. Gray Wolf abandoned his work with the horses and joined Michael and Jed around the kitchen table as they opened the latest batch of letters. The first envelope bore the official seal of the Federal Marshal's office in Denver, and Marshal Hayes's familiar handwriting. His letter brought news that several other mining conspiracies had been uncovered using the methods developed during their investigation, leading to arrests in 3 additional territories. The network of corruption that had seemed so powerful and untouchable was crumbling as honest officials finally had the evidence they needed to act. "Listen to this," Jed said, reading from Hayes's letter. "The Cherokee Nation has formally requested that Gray Wolf be appointed as a liaison between tribal authorities and federal investigators working on similar cases throughout the West. They want him to travel to other territories and help document crimes against Native communities." Gray Wolf looked up from the letter he had been reading, his dark eyes shining with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "It would be an honor to serve my people that way," he said carefully. "But I don't want to leave the ranch unless you think it's the right thing to do." Michael reached across the table and placed his hand on Gray Wolf's shoulder. "Mary sent you here to find justice for your people," he said with the wisdom that had come from his own journey through manipulation and truth. "Maybe this appointment is how you continue that work on a larger scale." Jed nodded agreement, though the thought of losing Gray Wolf's daily presence at the ranch created a hollow feeling in his chest. "The boy's right," he said, using the affectionate term that had become his standard way of addressing his Cherokee son. "Your sister's work didn't end with our victory. It was just the beginning of something bigger." The second letter bore more personal news that brought smiles to all their faces. Helena Vasquez, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, had written to accept Michael's proposal of marriage. The courtship had begun during the winter months when Michael was recovering from wounds received on Crying Eagle Mesa, and Helena's gentle nursing had grown into something deeper as she learned about his journey from manipulation to truth. "June 15th, Michael announced, his face glowing with happiness as he read Helena's acceptance letter. "She wants to have the ceremony at her father's ranch, with both Cherokee and Catholic traditions represented." He looked at Gray Wolf. "She specifically asked if you would participate as my brother in the Cherokee portions of the service." The request carried profound meaning in Cherokee culture, representing not just friendship, but the formal adoption of Gray Wolf into the Thornfield family structure. Such recognition from a white family was almost unprecedented, and Gray Wolf felt the weight of honor it represented. "I would be proud to stand as your brother," he said solemnly, then added with a grin, "though I'll need Joseph Ridge to teach me the proper ceremonies." The third letter brought news that was both expected and bittersweet. Tom Whitfield, the neighbor who had warned them about Cassidy's searches, was selling his ranch and moving back east to live with his daughter's family. The isolation and dangers of frontier life had finally overcome his stubborn determination to remain in the valley, and he wanted the Thornfields to have the first opportunity to purchase his land. It would double the size of our operation. Jed mused, studying the boundaries marked on the rough map Whitfield had included with his letter. Give us enough range to support a much larger herd and maybe start that horse breeding program Gray Wolf has been talking about. The horse breeding program had been Gray Wolf's idea, based on his observation that the Mustangs native to the Colorado high country possessed qualities that could improve the stamina and intelligence of domesticated horses. Michael had supported the proposal enthusiastically, seeing it as a way to combine Cherokee knowledge of horse behavior with modern ranching techniques. We'd need help managing that much land, Michael pointed out practically. Even with the three of us working full-time, we couldn't handle the additional cattle and horses properly. Gray Wolf had been thinking about this possibility for weeks, and he offered a solution that reflected both his Cherokee heritage and his understanding of their unique situation. What about some of the Cherokee families who lost their homes during the conspiracy? Joseph Ridge mentioned that several groups are looking for places to resettle where they can live peacefully alongside white neighbors. The suggestion opened possibilities that none of them had previously considered. A ranch operated jointly by Cherokee and white families would be virtually unique in the Colorado Territory, but their shared experiences had proven that such cooperation was not only possible but beneficial to everyone involved. As they discussed the practical details of expansion, Gray Wolf brought up a subject that had been weighing on his mind since receiving the federal appointment offer. If I accept the liaison position, I'll be traveling for months at a time, he said. But I could arrange my schedule so that I'm always here for the important seasons. Branding, roundup, breaking horses in the spring. Jed leaned back in his chair, considering the logistics of their evolving situation. The lonely rancher who had ridden into Willow Creek 8 months earlier to buy a rifle would never have imagined the complex and rewarding life that was taking shape around him. Seems to me we're building something here that's bigger than any one person, he said finally. Something that can accommodate all our different paths while keeping us connected as family. Over the following weeks, they began implementing plans that would transform the Thornfield Ranch into something unprecedented in territorial history. Gray Wolf accepted the federal liaison position, but negotiated a schedule that would allow him to return home between assignments. Michael and Helena moved their wedding date up to May to ensure Gray Wolf could participate before his first official travel. Tom Whitfield's land was purchased with money from a federal compensation fund established for victims of the mining conspiracy. Most significantly, Joseph Ridge arrived with 3 Cherokee families who were seeking a new start after losing their homes to the conspiracy's violence. The cultural exchange that began during those first conversations around Yet's kitchen table would eventually become a model for peaceful cooperation that other communities throughout the West would attempt to replicate. The wedding of Michael Thornfield and Helena Vasquez took place on a perfect May morning, when the valley was dressed in its spring finery and the peaks still wore caps of snow that caught the early sunlight like jewels. The ceremony itself reflected the blending of cultures that had become central to their lives, with Catholic priests and Cherokee elders sharing responsibilities for blessing the union. Gray Wolf stood beside Michael during the Cherokee portions of the ceremony, wearing traditional clothing that Joseph Ridge had helped him prepare. The sight of a Cherokee boy formally recognized as brother to a white rancher's son drew tears from many of the wedding guests, who understood the historical significance of what they were witnessing. Mary would have loved this, Gray Wolf whispered to Michael as they participated in the traditional exchange of gifts that symbolized the joining of 2 families. She always believed that people of different cultures could learn from each other instead of fighting, Helena proved. To be everything Michael had hoped for in a wife and more than either Jed or Grey Wolf had dared to expect in a daughter and sister. Her immediate acceptance of Grey Wolf as family, her genuine interest in Cherokee culture, and her practical skills as a rancher's daughter made her integration into their unconventional household seem effortless. By midsummer, the expanded ranch was operating with the kind of efficiency that could only come from people who trusted each other completely and shared common goals. The Cherokee families had established their own homes on the property while contributing their skills to the overall operation. Grey Wolf had departed for his first assignment as federal liaison, but his letters arrived regularly with news of his investigations and promises of his return for the autumn roundup. Jed found himself adapting to the role of patriarch for an extended family that included not just his own son and Cherokee brother, but Helena, the Cherokee families, and the various helpers and neighbors who had become part of their community. The isolation and loneliness that had nearly destroyed him after Sarah's death had been replaced by a richness of human connection that surpassed even his happiest memories of his original family. One evening in late summer, as he sat on the front porch watching Helena teach Cherokee children to read while Michael and the Cherokee fathers worked together to repair a fence damaged by lightning, Jed reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this place. A desperate trip to buy a rifle had led to the salvation of his family, the destruction of a criminal conspiracy, and the creation of something entirely new in the American West. A letter from Grey Wolf arrived that evening, carried by a traveling merchant who had encountered the young Cherokee liaison in New Mexico territory. The letter brought news of successful investigations and prosecutions, but also a more personal message that touched the hearts of everyone who heard it. I have seen many places and met many people during these months of travel, Grey Wolf had written in his careful script. I have learned that the crimes committed against our families were part of a pattern that stretched across the entire frontier. But I have also learned that solution we found together, different peoples choosing to trust and support each other, is spreading to other communities as well. The letter continued with descriptions of other ranches and settlements where Cherokee and white families were beginning to work together, often using the Thornfield Ranch as their model. The promise that Mary Crow Feather had extracted from her dying brother was bearing fruit in ways that none of them had imagined possible. The most important thing I have learned, the letter concluded, is that home is not a place you are born, but a place where you are loved and needed and respected for who you truly are. The Thornfield Ranch will always be home to me, no matter how far my work takes me, because it is where I learned what family really means. As autumn painted the aspens gold and the first light snows zested the high peaks, Grey Wolf returned from his first assignment to find the ranch prospering beyond his most optimistic expectations. The horse breeding program was producing colts that combined the best qualities of wild and domestic bloodlines. The cattle operation had expanded to support 3 times as many animals as the ranch had carried during Yet's lonely years. Most importantly, the community they had built was attracting visitors from throughout the territory who wanted to learn about their model of cooperation. "Welcome home, brother," Michael said as Grey Wolf swung down from his travel-worn horse, the greeting carrying all the warmth and acceptance that the young Cherokee man had longed for during his childhood of loss and wandering. Grey Wolf looked around at the bustling ranch, the mixed families working together, the children playing games that combined Cherokee and white traditions, and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from promises kept and purposes fulfilled. "Mary's work is spreading," he told Jed and Michael as they gathered around the familiar kitchen table. "There are communities from Texas to Montana where people are choosing cooperation over conflict." As winter approached and the extended family gathered for the evening meals that had become their tradition, Jed often thought about the mysterious ways that tragedy could lead to triumph, how loss could become the foundation for unexpected joy. The rifle he had never bought, the Cherokee boy who had asked to come with him, and the son who had found his way back to truth. had combined to create something that none of them could have imagined alone. They say the frontier changes people. Jed remarked one evening as they sat around the fire, listening to Helena tell stories that blended Cherokee legends with Mexican folktales while the children listened with rapt attention. But I think what really changes people is learning to see the world through someone else's eyes. Gray Wolf nodded, thinking of his sister Mary and the promise that had brought him to this place. Mary used to say that the Great Spirit gives us exactly the family we need, even if it doesn't look like what we expected, he said softly. She was right about that, just like she was right about everything else. Outside, the first major snowfall of winter was beginning to dust the valley with white, promising months of quiet intimacy before the spring work began again. But inside the Thornfield ranch house, the warmth of genuine family love created a refuge that would endure through all seasons, a testament to the power of choosing trust over fear, cooperation over conflict, and love over hatred. The Cherokee boy's promise to his dying sister had been kept in ways that surpassed even Mary Crow Feather's dying hopes. Justice had been served, families had been healed, and a new model for frontier life had been born from the ashes of tragedy and the seeds of unexpected friendship.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.